Hello everybody and welcome back to Dollar Tree Dinners. My name is Rebecca and this is another Cheap Eats episode to hopefully give you some ideas on meals that you can make that don't require a lot of ingredients or are pretty inexpensive to make. Today we're going to be trying one that was suggested to me many times, which is Southern style beans and cornbread. So while I was born and raised in North Carolina, my mom's from New Hampshire and my dad is from Michigan, so I actually wasn't exposed to very many Southern foods growing up. Beans and cornbread is considered a fairly classic Southern dish, and today we're going to make it and try it for the first time. It's believed to have originated in West Virginia, and it is definitely a feed your whole family on a budget kind of meal. To make beans and cornbread, you will of course need beans and cornbread, but the dish itself is not as simplistic as the name would suggest. The type of beans that's in this is usually pinto beans, although realistically you can use any type of bean that you have. After all, every recipe that exists and is considered traditional usually started with a mom or a grandma feeding her family with whatever she had on hand, so it's important not to get tied up in the details. I'm using a pound of dry pinto beans that I got at Food Lion for $1.28. You will also need meat of some kind, usually the smoked variety. I find these at Food Lion in the seasoning meats department. These are usually fairly inexpensive and are meant to provide flavor to the dish. They are intended for cooking with dry beans or things like collard greens. And this is another use whatever is cheapest moment. I've seen people use ham hocks, turkey necks, turkey legs, pork necks, whatever you can get that is cheapest at the moment. I am using pork necks that I got for $4.08. The next thing is onions. I recommend buying the biggest and cheapest onion that you can find. I got this gargantuan white onion for $1.60. And it is quite literally bigger than my hand. Lastly, you will need broth or stock and a handful of basic seasonings. You can make your own stock, you can buy pre-made stock, or what I recommend is getting a big jar of chicken bouillon powder. This is a few dollars, but it will last you a long time. And the cheapest place that I have found it is at Dollar General for $2.50. Cornbread is a side dish. Again, use whatever is cheapest to you. I'm partial to Jiffy mixes, but those do require milk and eggs. There is a self-rising cornmeal mix that would be a little bit cheaper than buying Jiffy boxes, but again, this does require milk and eggs to make it. I did see a variety of different cornbread mixes that only require water to make them, and if you have a fairly well-stocked pantry, then you can just buy cornmeal and make the cornbread from scratch. I'm going to be using one of the just add water mixes today because I typically like to showcase things that don't require additional ingredients. I got the Marie Callender's honey butter cornbread mix. It's $1.99 each, but at my Food Lion it was buy two, get one free. I'm probably only going to be using two today, and the other one will go in my pantry for later. So for the beans, neck bone, onions, and cornbread, my cost was $10.94, but this should make about 8 servings, so that's about $1.36 a serving. The first thing we need to do is soak our beans, which I have already done. I like to soak them in the pot I'm going to be cooking them in so that I don't have unnecessary dishes. This can be made in a slow cooker, but I don't have the necessary patience for slow cookers, so I'm going to be making this in my Dutch oven. I just check the beans to make sure there aren't any pebbles or rocks. The machines that sort beans can't distinguish a bean from a pebble, so it's best to just check. I've only ever found a rock once or twice in my entire adult life. Then I'll put them in the pot and I'll cover them with water. I also like to add a tablespoon of salt, and I'll cover them and soak them overnight. And now that that is out of the way, let's make some beans and cornbread. So now that my beans have soaked overnight, we're going to drain them and rinse them really well. I am also going to dice up my extremely large onion. Of course, if you don't have one this big, then you can use 2 smaller onions instead. I'm going to keep this a fairly large dice because I wanted to add a little bit of texture into the beans. Now, if you're doing this in the crock pot, this is one of those kind of set it and forget it. You're going to dump everything in the crock pot and just let it run for 6 to 8 hours on high. But again, I'm doing this in my Dutch oven because it takes a lot less time that way, and I don't have a lot of patience to wait for things. It's still going to take a good bit of time, but not 7 to 8 hours. It's going to take closer to 2.5 to 3. Next, I'm going to go in with my large diced onion. And I'm actually going to take the time to caramelize this onion. A lot of recipes don't call for that, but again, I think that's going to add a lot of richness and flavor into this. So I'm going to let these brown up a good bit. I'm not going for fully caramelized, just a little bit of color, as you can see. This is gonna take about 10 to 15 minutes or so, but you can definitely skip this. As I mentioned, I don't see many people doing this. A lot of people make this in the crock pot, so they don't go through this extra step of caramelizing the onions, which again, if you're gonna do it in the crock pot, just dump it, set it, and forget it. But if you're gonna be making it on the stovetop, then it's worth doing a little bit of extra work for some extra flavor. Color is free flavor. And now we're gonna nestle in our little, in my case, I'm using pork necks, smoked pork necks, which smell fabulous. Just go ahead and nestle those in on the bottom there. Along with our soaked pinto beans. And now we're gonna add enough water to cover everything up by about an inch. Season it to taste. I'm gonna be adding a couple tablespoons of this chicken bouillon powder, along with plenty of pepper, some garlic powder, and onion powder. As usual, I'm not gonna be adding salt right now because there's a lot of salt in the bouillon, but there's also a good bit of salt in those cured meats. So I'm gonna wait until it's almost done and then salt it at the end. And then we're gonna let this come up to a boil. I'm not disturbing the pork necks at the bottom. I'm just kind of stirring on top just to distribute all the seasonings and stuff. But we are gonna cover this and simmer it for about 2 hours. It's been about 2.5 hours, maybe closer to 3. Kind of ended up setting it and forgetting it anyways. But let's go and take out these bones. And let those cool a minute so we can shred them up. I'm also gonna let this simmer uncovered for a minute so that we can reduce off some of the liquid because it is looking a little soupy for me. In the meantime, I'm gonna preheat my oven to 400 for making the cornbread. And we've got to make a classic skillet cornbread, although technically you don't need to do it in a skillet. You can do it in a cake pan, baking dish, anything you have. Butter or oil in the bottom of the skillet, pretty decent amount. And the skillet or cake pan is going to go into the oven while it preheats. So this should be fairly tender, enough to shred off the bones after a couple of hours. The longer it cooks, the more tender this meat's going to get. You can see how gorgeous and pink that meat is because it is smoked. That's a pretty decent amount of meat that came off of those bones because again, that was only $4 for that whole pack. We can add all of our meat back into our beans. So at this point our beans are done, our meat is shredded, and this is pretty much done. But at this point is really just when you can kind of adjust the consistency of it. So as I mentioned, this is a little too soupy for me. I know they are technically called soup beans, but I do want to reduce this down just a little bit. So while I'm working on the cornbread aspect of it, I'm gonna let this go on high for a little bit to try to thicken it up a little bit. So let's mix up our cornbread. I'm using 2 packs because I'm making a skillet of cornbread, but I do have a third because they were buy 2 get 1 free. They each call for 2/3 of a cup of water, so I'm gonna do 1 cup and 1/3. Take your hot skillet out of the oven or cake pan, depending on what you're using, and pour that cornbread mix right in there. It's gonna start to bubble up and fry right away. Now let's pop that back in the oven for about 18 minutes. My beans are still bubbling away and it's definitely starting to thicken up a bit. I also tasted it for seasoning and I am gonna add some salt and pepper to it. So you can kind of see where the line started, which is up about here. So we've dropped about 1/2 inch of liquid just in the time that I've been simmering this with the pot lid off. It did start to kind of stick to the bottom, so I scraped it off the bottom a bit and I've reduced the heat down to low. And I'm just gonna let this continue on low until the cornbread's ready, but we've definitely lost a good bit of liquid, at least 1/2 inch since I started reducing it down. So there is our skillet cornbread out of the oven. We'll let that cool for a minute and then we're gonna plate it up and try it. So as I mentioned, this is about 8 servings. We've got a big hefty pot of our Southern style pinto beans, and then we have our cornbread, which I have already cut into 8 slices. I've seen a lot of people that serve the cornbread in the beans, but I'm gonna serve them separately because I actually usually like to just crumble my cornbread on top of things. Honey butter cornbread to go on the side. I do have a bit of a confession to make, which is that I've never had beans and cornbread before today, but I have been tasting it while I've been cooking it, and I can say that if you have never made this before, you are definitely missing out, at least the bean portion. I haven't tried the whole meal together with the cornbread. I did just go ahead and add the cornbread on top. I don't know, you guys will have to let me know how you usually eat it. Do you crumble it in, do you eat it separately, or do you mix it in with the beans? The flavor of this is absolutely unreal. It's so smoky, but ever so slightly sweet, and the beans are perfectly tender. It feels like I'm not eating a bowl of beans. It feels like I'm eating barbecue, basically. I love the meat that's in here too. It's very tender. I would go so far as to say that this is probably the best way that I have ever had beans in my entire life. Gotta mix in some of that honey butter cornbread. I can see why so many people recommended that I tried this recipe. It seems so basic, but it is incredibly delicious. The cornbread adds a sweetness to it. It's already kind of salty, it's a little smoky, and then you add that sweetness to it. It gives it a different texture. It's almost like eating cake with it in a sense. I think I'm in love with these beans. And I can also definitely recommend this Just Add Water cornbread mix. It's really sweet. It's got a nice texture to it. You don't need the milk and you don't need the egg. It is a little bit more expensive than other corn muffin mixes at $1.99 a pouch, but it's really good. And if you see it on sale, I would not hesitate to pick up a few bags. Let me know in the comments, have you ever had Southern style beans and cornbread? Do you make it a little bit differently? I'd love to hear your recipe if you make it. Also, if you have any suggestions for what I should feature next, leave them in the comments down below. But I hope you guys are having a fantastic day, and I will see you again soon.